Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Last week, the sixth COVID-19 economic response package was announced. 20 billion ringgit worth of initiatives known as the Strategic Program to Empower People and the Economy, or referred to by the government as Pemerkasa. Let's take a closer look at how this package and all the others in the past 1 year has and will address the economic needs of Malaysians. Joining us first on the show, we have Tricia Yeoh. She's the CEO of the think tank Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, or better known as IDEAS. Tricia, good to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, the 20 billion ringgit Pemerkasa package, that essentially brings the total size of the economic response packages that have been announced in the past 1 year. That brings it to 340 billion ringgit in total. That's a sizable amount. It's a big chunk, I believe about a fifth of the Malaysian GDP. Tricia, have these initiatives, despite the headline figure, have the initiatives in the breakdown of what's been announced hit the right marks in terms of the type of assistance provided, not just in past packages, but also in Pemerkasa?
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thanks for having me again on Consider This. I think, maybe what I'll talk about is just some of the things that seem a little bit different from this particular package compared to the previous ones. I think this particular package looks, it is actually representing quite a high level of fiscal injections from government funds, and the target seems to be geared, yes, there seems to be targeting of a whole range of different groups, including the SMEs, informal workers, youth, tourism sector, entrepreneurs, and so on. I mean, as have the other packages been as well, but this particular one seemed to have several initiatives that were targeted at people with disabilities and also for women. So, but back to the question that you've asked about whether this is hitting the target, I would say that to a large extent they are, but as in the target groups that they have identified are the accurate ones who are actually suffering. But in order to get a better view of whether all of these things, as has been announced, are being implemented well, I mean, that's the separate question as well. And so IDEAS actually has been doing quite a lot of research in looking through the various Laksana reports and trying to match that against what the government has announced. So are the announcements being implemented in the way that they said that they're going to, and also whether these are being reported on accurately. And so I can talk more about that.
Yeah. So just very quickly to interject before Sharaad, your question, the Laksana reports that you're referring to, Tricia, Laksana is the body that executes these stimulus packages, yes?
Yeah, so Laksana forms specifically to implement as well as monitor what happens within the stimulus packages. And so they have reports, they have a microsite for the various reports, Prihatin, Penjana, Permai, Pemerkasa, and so on. I mean, some of them haven't been reported on yet, but we've been doing that kind of very deep data mining, and it's a lot to actually monitor, but we will be coming up with our own reports on the Laksana reports very soon.
Okay.
Yeah. Tricia, we've gone, this question keeps coming up over and over again, the question of data, the question of access to data, or even independent data in order to triangulate some of the claims that a government makes about the effectiveness of its programs. What have you discerned from government side, at least in terms of its objective, an evolution of of their response, that they are taking evidence or data and tweaking their own response, or rethinking or recalibrating their response? Is there anything of that sort happening?
I would like to say so, but at the moment, I don't know, apart from one very large scale survey that they did, which actually was included in one of their reports. So this is a survey that covered 11,000 respondents, most of whom were supposed to be recipients of some of the stimulus package schemes. and they used that to provide feedback as to whether these people were getting the right kind of support and so on. But apart from that one particular survey, I mean, of course, this comes to the question of transparency, right? So we don't actually know how government makes their decisions on how they're selecting the groups and which are the groups that require more. I mean, in reality and also in practice, I think the exposure that some of us in this think tank world have is that they would invite people for these consultations, or perhaps less systematically, people would come forth with their own concerns, in a way lobbying for more allocations. So that's the very unscientific way of putting forth their demands in a more qualitative style. So I do think that having access to data would actually help the government to do that, to be more informed about which target groups are more important. But I think the greater interest for us as members of the public, as members of civil society, would be that government also tells us how those decisions come about.
Right, because it's not just about the target groups, right? It's the form in which the assistance appears. So it's not just about direct transfers. We've seen a lot of that in the past packages, and that I think that's mainly a demand from the public. Short-term cash transfers to help with immediate financial needs. But some of the packages, including Pemerkasa, have also had different types of provisions or different types of loan deferment or government guarantees and the like. How, looking at all 6 of these packages, Tricia, how are you seeing in terms of a trend, the forms of assistance that government is providing through its economic response packages?
Right. So again, like I think we love the research, right, and kind of like diving deep into it. So my team has looked at the data of all the various stimulus packages. And out of at least what has been captured so far, out of I think almost 320 billion, we've divided that up into like 5 different types of stimulus. So 5 different stimulus types within the various initiatives. And we found that, of course, the government expenditure is about 39%, but deferrals actually represent 35%, and that's followed by guarantees of 18%, and then revenue of 5% and liquidity of 3%. So yeah, I mean, if you want that, we can share that with you. Basically, these are the.
But what does that mean? Because different types of assistance. How impactful is, say, a loan deferment on payments versus, say, foregone government revenue in terms of, say, deduction of or exemption of tax? I mean, in terms of impact, are there different types of impact for different types of forms of assistance?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think you're right in terms of like deferrals would have a greater impact, but we don't really have statistics to show for that. Or rather, if there are, then they have not been published, at least in the forms that we are aware of. I do know, like I said, in those sort of like private consultations, the data is available by government, and government does have access to that. So for instance, like Bank Negara would have some of this research and data. Definitely Laksana would have it. But I mean, unfortunately, just because this is essentially big data, and we just simply don't have that, and I can't tell you for sure like which types of stimulus initiatives would be much more impactful compared to something else. I mean, I can just tell you like the breakdowns of them, but we would not know what the impact is unless we actually had access to the large data and by demographies.
Right.
Okay, Tricia, if we could maybe focus on the kind of decisions the government has also made along with this announcement. One of them is to fix the ceiling price of petrol and diesel, I believe. Is this, because the debate seems to be that in fixing prices, it helps businesses control costs and anticipate costs, but it also puts a strain on government coffers. Where does ideas stand in terms of these kinds of trade-offs that the government is making?
I think ultimately fixing the price may allow these businesses and recipients to, it's sort of like providing a buffer for a short-term period, a short-term buffer to current shocks. But I think in the long term, that's not really a sustainable measure. I think more broadly speaking, where our research has led us to is that we think that the entire taxation system and the entire fiscal system of Malaysia is under considerable strain, and therefore there's a need to relook at our taxation sources, because we know that very few people, or a small percentage of our employed and working people in Malaysia actually contribute to income tax. And we know, of course, the previous government rolled back the GST in favor of the SST. So I know this is not the time to talk about it, and I've said this several times, but at some point, the government needs to look at where its tax base, broadening its tax base, and where the tax base is coming from.
The fact that the finance ministry also announced directly channeling special assistance of about 260 million ringgit to all state governments, and that's I think 20 million ringgit for each state. So equally, doesn't matter, every state will receive this amount of allocation. I'm wondering how you're reading into that. Is this the right move for the government in terms of equal allocation for each state, or should it be, you know, tailored to each state? How are you reading it?
So actually, well, yeah, I think my two immediate reactions to that would be like, number one, what is the modus operandi of these allocations and distributions? So from what I know from my own research, they would probably transfer it to the state governments that are aligned to the federal ruling coalition, but they would probably channel it to their own institutions, and therefore directly bypassing the state government that is in question when it comes to being able to distribute those resources. So that's one. The second immediate reaction would be, I think what you're alluding to is that the monies should not be equally allocated according to every state.
Well, do you think it's a good idea to have equal allocation? I mean, it's great, but then will, say, Perlis need as much money as Selangor, as much money as Sabah and Sarawak, for instance?
Yeah, so it depends on how they are. I mean, whether or not, and I actually have not looked at this yet, like, are they earmarking the allocations for certain things? Because if it's got to do with COVID-19 vaccinations, or, you know, allowing testing or something like that, then it can follow the demographic, because then the size of the population is higher in Selangor than in Perlis. But I think whatever the case, there should be some kind of matrix to determine, like, why are all states being given that amount, and there should be a way to determine a formula where if poorer states may want to receive more, if it's about economic assistance. If it's about population size determinations, then again, that should be a different way of determining it. But definitely a blanket 20 million for all states equally, I think that does not really make sense in my opinion.
Well, I guess the idea is to help revive the local economy. We'll see how this pans out. It's all in the execution. Tricia, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Melisa.
We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but more on the Pemerkasa package after the break. Stay tuned to Consider This. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa. Idris. With me is Sharaad, Kuttan. Let's continue our conversation about how the COVID-19 economic response package, or more commonly referred to by the government as Pemerkasa, is going to help the current situation with the economy. Dr Juita Mohamad joins us on the line now. She's a fellow of Economics, Trade and Regional Integration Division at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, or better known as ISIS Malaysia. Juita, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So Pemerkasa, it's the sixth economic response package that's been announced in the past year. And I'm wondering, since it's number 6 now, and we've been through a year, perhaps the economic demands or needs are slightly different from, say, a year ago. How would you compare this economic response package to the others? And do you think it adequately addresses what Malaysia's economy needs right now?
So looking at all of the stimulus packages, we can see that the main objectives of these assistance are mainly three-pronged. It's there to preserve the welfare of the people through introduction of social protection. It is there to support businesses and MSMEs on the ground. It is also there to strengthen economic activities in the years to come. So again, to preserve the welfare of Malaysians, measures such as one-off cash transfers to vulnerable households and groups, increase in allowances for frontliners, extension of moratoriums on loans, and also the withdrawal of pension funds were introduced throughout all of these six different packages. Again, we see that wage subsidies were also allocated for employers to continue with their business activities. And again, these efforts were put in place to soften the negative impacts of the pandemic and the much needed movement controls. So by making more disposable income available to the vulnerable groups, it can help households who have lost their livelihoods and also stimulate the consumption on essential goods for businesses on the ground in the immediate term. But in terms of coverage, I believe it can be improved tremendously. And looking at Pemerkasa specifically, it carries on similar assistance on wage subsidies and also special grants for MSMEs and also microcredit programs. It has a special focus on the tourism industry as well as the vaccination rollout program. So even though the stimulus packages have been introduced in different stages, my concern is still on the targeting of the recipients and on the coverage. So as funds for each program is very much limited, it will come at a first come and first served basis. And unclear guidelines on how the funds will be disseminated and on how the funds will reach those in need are issues to be revisited and improved upon by government agencies.
Okay.
Juita, do you see or discern a shift in the way government is thinking about both the pandemic and the consequences to the economy? Has there been, to your knowledge, sufficient monitoring, and is the data that's being collected driving policy in a different direction, or is it just strengthening the resolve to keep the course, as it were, in terms of the dimensions you've just mentioned?
Well, I think the problem with monitoring and also data collection is very much of a problem even before the pandemic. So for example, when we look at our social protection, like one-off handouts of BSH and also BRIM, there wasn't just one data collection system, but it comprises of many different data sets from different agencies. So again, we haven't done rigorous analysis on the effectiveness of these social protection like assistance. And I would like to see that happening with all of the stimulus packages so that we can track down the impacts that it has on vulnerable households. But as for now, I think data collection and monitoring is very much lacking still.
So Juita, you mentioned coverage could be improved tremendously. You're also raising, you're highlighting that targeting of the recipients could be a cause for concern. Can I ask you, are these just is this the design of these stimulus packages, or is it in the execution of it? Is it in the bureaucracy or the bureaucratic processes that need to be addressed by government agencies and the like?
I think in short, it has to do a lot about the bureaucracy. We see that after a year since our first MCO, the assistance highlighted in the Pemerkasa program, again, is very much needed. I'm not saying that it's not needed. My only concern is on the disbursement process and also the criteria for application. Again, we observed these challenges last year when a share of the MSME community was not able to tap into the microcredit programs due to additional requirements such as registration at LHDN and the like, which are needed. Even though the assistance is very much meant for them, due to additional criteria, they were left out or marginalized. So I feel that there is much room for improvement here, just as long as government agencies work together rather than work in silos.
Right.
Juita, do we have an economist doing sufficient work in this area, looking at the impact the last year's had, especially on the SMEs? I mean, do we know how many SMEs have gone under? What likelihood, they have? Are they to come back, even with, these support systems being dished out at this point in time? Do we have any sense of that?
Well, again, it depends a lot on data availability on the ground. So I think this year would be a good year to look back at how the pandemic has impacted different sectors. ISIS Malaysia did a national interest analysis on the pandemic on our socio-economic sector, but then this was funneled to EPU directly for the formulation of RMK12. But again, we've seen numbers that right after the MCO, the first MCO was introduced, the number of firms that went bankrupt was on the rise. And the longer the period of the pandemic lasts, the more firms that will go under. And I think we need to brace for that, especially when we have recorded negative growth for the first time in a very long time last year.
Right. When the earlier packages were announced, no one could have foreseen that it was going to last this long. A year ago, we were thinking about a 3-month, 6-month horizon in terms of economic recovery. We now know better. It's going to be a long haul. And I'm wondering, Juita, and the design of these economic response packages, how do we balance the short-term needs, the immediate cash transfers, those microcredit financing injections of liquidity that you mentioned a bit earlier? How do we balance that against long-term economic recovery plans, job creation, stimulating the economy? How do we balance the two? Because sometimes is there a trade-off? Is it short-term handouts versus long-term recovery? Is that a trade-off when it comes to designing economic response packages like Pemerkasa?
Well, there are costs to these stimulus packages, I feel, in the medium to long term. And I'm going to give you an example for our EPF contributors. So again, I feel that Malaysia should develop a more resilient and permanent social safety net, especially when EPF contributors are now able to tap into their savings before the age of retirement. Again, while short-term initiatives are very much needed in times of pandemic like this, looking ahead into our trend in becoming an aging society in the next 5 years or so before reaching a high income status country is very worrying. We saw that 70% of our EPF contributors have less than 50,000 ringgit in their accounts, which is again not sufficient at all. And again, ASEAN data have also recorded that to retire comfortably, Malaysians would need around $300,000 to survive. So again, there are costs to these measures with that in the future.
Right. There's the question that perhaps goes around not just with analysts but in the coffee shops of Malaysia, which is to do with those big numbers we see in the media and impact, right? So, and any number of people, including the former finance ministers, come out and say, too small, it's not going to have an impact. How do economists think about impact? Is it a function of the size of the economy and the size of the package in relation? What's your position on this, Juita?
So again, when we look at the size of the stimulus package, we don't look at the immediate number or the value, the nominal value. We look at the value spent per capita on a per capita basis. So we found that ISIS did a short analysis on this, and we found that Malaysia is spending more per capita compared to Indonesia. We also found that countries like Taiwan, they spend less on stimulus packages due to their fast border controls. So again, despite the pandemic, Taiwan recorded a 3% GDP growth when the rest of the world is undergoing recession. So to see whether these packages and these assistance are effective, we actually need to look at it in the medium term. So such indicators that we can look into are GDP growth, unemployment rate, and job creation can be good measures, including as well FDI inflows.
Right. Okay. So we're going to have to see the impact in terms of the macroeconomic numbers that will come out in the coming weeks and months. Juita, thank you so much for joining us on the show and sharing those insights in your research. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. Don't forget to get all the latest news on COVID-19 vaccines on astroawani.com, as well as our Astro Awani app. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.